April 12, 1861. A date seared into the memory of a nation. One cannon, one flash of fire in the pre-dawn darkness. And the course of American history was changed forever. This single moment wasn't just the start of a battle. It was the deafening thunderclap at the end of a long, gathering storm. A storm that had been brewing for decades, fueled by anger, fear, and deeply divided beliefs, finally exploded over a small, isolated fort in Charleston Harbor. Behind that explosion were secrets, pride, and acts of betrayal that pushed the country past the point of no return. To understand how it all came to this, we have to go back. Let's rewind to America in 1860. It was a young nation, barely 80 years old, still experimenting with the radical idea of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It was a land of boundless promise, a beacon of freedom to the world. But beneath this shiny surface of liberty and opportunity, a deep, infected wound had been festering since its very birth. The institution of slavery. By 1860, this wound had grown so toxic that the North and the South no longer saw themselves as part of the same country. To many in the industrializing North, slavery was a profound moral curse, a stain on the nation's soul that contradicted every principle the country was founded on. The abolitionist movement was gaining momentum, its calls for an end to human bondage growing louder and more insistent every day. But to the agrarian South, slavery wasn't just an economic system. It was the very foundation of their society, their culture, and their way of life. The idea of abolishing it was seen not just as an economic threat, but as an existential one. The two regions were speaking different languages, living in different realities, and their paths were diverging at an alarming rate. Then came the presidential election of 1860. The nation held its breath. When Abraham Lincoln, the candidate of the new anti-slavery Republican Party, was elected president, the South saw it as a declaration of war on their entire world. For them, Lincoln's victory was the final, unforgivable act of Northern aggression. The fuse, which had been sizzling for years, was now lit and burning fast. By the time Lincoln placed his hand on the Bible to take his oath of office in March of 1861, the Union was already fractured. 7 southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had already seceded. They had packed their bags and walked out on the American experiment, forming a new nation they called the Confederate States of America. Their message to Lincoln and the rest of the country was chillingly clear. They would rather tear the Union apart, destroy the very country their forefathers had built, than live under a government that they believed threatened their right to own other human beings. The great American family was broken, and right in the middle of this political earthquake, sitting defiantly in the heart of Charleston Harbor, the epicenter of secession, was Fort Sumter. It was a small, 5-sided brick fortress, not even fully completed, but it was a powerful symbol. On its flagpole, the stars and stripes still flew, a lonely outpost of federal authority in a sea of rebellion. Inside its walls were just 85 Union soldiers, led by Major Robert Anderson. They were completely surrounded, cut off, and vastly outnumbered by thousands of Confederate troops and dozens of heavy cannons now aimed directly at them from the surrounding shoreline. Major Anderson was a man caught in an impossible position. He was a Kentuckian, a former slave owner himself, but his loyalty was to the United States Army and the flag he served. He was a Union man trapped deep in the heart of the Confederacy, watching the guns being positioned to destroy him and his men. He was running out of food, out of supplies, and out of time. Back in Washington, the brand new president, Abraham Lincoln, faced his first and perhaps most critical test. The fate of the nation rested on his shoulders, and he had an impossible choice to make. If he sent ships to resupply Fort Sumter, the Confederates would almost certainly see it as an act of aggression, an invasion, and it would trigger the war he desperately wanted to avoid. But if he did nothing, if he ordered Anderson to surrender the fort, it would be seen as a sign of weakness. It would legitimize the Confederacy, signaling that the federal government was powerless to stop the country from dissolving. The Union would likely crumble without a single shot being fired. Every eye in America, North and South, was fixed on that little fort in Charleston Harbor. The world watched and waited. Lincoln, in a masterful political move, decided to thread the needle. He announced that he would send unarmed ships, carrying only food and provisions, to the starving soldiers. No troops, no ammunition. The move was brilliant. It placed the burden of starting a war squarely on the shoulders of the Confederates. If they fired on ships, bringing food to hungry men, they would be the aggressors in the eyes of the world. But the new Confederate government in Montgomery, Alabama, saw things differently. To them, any attempt to resupply the fort was a challenge to their sovereignty. They couldn't allow a foreign flag to fly in their most important harbor. Their president, Jefferson Davis, and his cabinet made a fateful decision. They sent a telegram to their commander in Charleston, General P.G.T. Beauregard. The message was final. Demand the immediate evacuation of Fort Sumter. If Major Anderson refused, Beauregard was to reduce the fort, meaning destroy it. And so we arrive at the final hours. The night of April 11th, 1861, Charleston was tense. The city sleeping fitfully under dark, stormy skies. A palpable sense of dread and anticipation hung in the air. Inside Fort Sumter, the Union soldiers knew their time was running out. They spent the night writing what could be their final letters home. Their words filled with love, fear, and patriotism, unsure if they would ever live to see them sent. Outside the fort, General Beauregard, who had once been Major Anderson's star pupil at West Point, grimly prepared his men to fire on his former mentor. At 3:20 in the morning, a small boat cut through the choppy waters of the harbor, carrying 2 Confederate officers to the fort. They delivered one final ultimatum to Major Anderson. He read the message, his face etched with exhaustion and resolve. He knew he could not surrender the fort. He politely refused. The Confederate messengers departed in silence, returning to their batteries on the shore. As their boat pulled away, one of them turned to Anderson and said, "We will open fire in 1 hour." The hour passed in an agonizing, deafening silence. The men in the fort stood by their guns, staring into the blackness, waiting. And then, at exactly 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, a single cannon from a Confederate battery on James Island fired. A mortar shell arced high into the night sky. A brilliant, terrifying streak of light that seemed to hang for an eternity before exploding directly over Fort Sumter. It was a signal. Within moments, dozens of other cannons around the harbor roared to life, unleashing a furious bombardment on the small fort. The war had begun. For the next 34 hours, the Confederates rained down thousands of shells on Fort Sumter. The Union soldiers, though outgunned, fired back with a courageous but ultimately futile defense. Miraculously, not a single soldier on either side was killed by the bombardment itself, but the fort was being systematically torn apart. Fires raged, walls crumbled, and their flag was shot down, only to be bravely raised again. Finally, with his barracks on fire and his ammunition nearly gone, Major Anderson had no choice. He surrendered the fort, but that single shot at 4:30 in the morning had already done its work. It had awakened a sleeping giant. In the north, the attack on the American flag ignited a firestorm of patriotic fury. Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion was answered by hundreds of thousands. The time for compromise was over. In the South, the victory was met with wild celebration, seen as a triumphant defense of their new nation. 4 more states would quickly join the Confederacy. No one standing on those shores in Charleston, no one in the fort, no one in the White House, could have possibly imagined the horror that would follow. No one knew that this single, symbolic shot would unleash a torrent of blood and suffering that would claim the lives of over 620,000 Americans, more than in all other American wars combined. It was the shot that started the bloodiest chapter in American history, a brutal, 4-year conflict that would test the very soul of the nation, and ultimately, through fire and sacrifice, redefine the meaning of freedom. It all started there, in the dark, before the dawn, with a single flash of light over Charleston Harbor. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this piece of history as compelling as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world. See you next time.